You know, I'm sometimes wary of frequently asked questions because I sometimes find that the questions that are actually listed in the frequently asked questions section are never actually the questions that I have. But I'm hoping that at least a few of you have some of the same questions that I ran into when I was learning Box2D, and I will try and answer some of those for you now. So the first question is, what's the difference between a shape and a body? And I think this is kind of confusing at first because some stuff that's included in a shape, like, the locations of the vertices of the polygon, makes sense. That sort of describes a shape. But then it starts to include things like density and restitution and kind of physics-y values. And you're like, what are those doing in a shape definition? Shouldn't those be kind of included in the body definition, given that the body seems to be more about the actual physical object? So maybe the best way to kind of make this clear is to think about a pencil. All right, now let's say you wanted to represent this pencil in Box2D. The simple one shape, one body way that we've been using for our crates would be to essentially make one shape that describes this whole pencil, the whole long rectangle with the pointy tip, and that would also be our body. Our body would consist of this one shape. Now, let's say you start putting this in your simulation and you realize, I'd really like my pencil to bounce differently if it lands on the eraser end. That eraser is made of rubber, it's springier. So you could do this. You could essentially create one body that's made up of two shapes. So these two shapes would consist of the wooden end, that's the long skinny rectangle with the pointy tip, and the rubbery end, that's the square at the end. These two shapes would now be described to the same body, but they would have very different properties. Obviously, the wooden end wouldn't have the same kind of restitution value that the rubbery end would have. The whole thing is still considered one body. You're only going to be asking yourself, what is the location and the velocity of the pencil? You're probably not going to be asking, what is the velocity of the rubbery end of the pencil, because that's probably going to be traveling some weird spiral motion as you throw the pencil across the room. So as far as kind of thinking of a body, which would be tracking an object with a position and a velocity and angular velocity, that would still apply to the entire pencil. However, you've now broken it up into multiple shapes. And I suppose you could go even crazier and make it out of 4 shapes, and you've got, like a shape for the graphite end and the little metal collar and that kind of stuff. But, let's not get carried away here. It's only a pencil. Other examples where you might see multiple shapes making up one body. A lollipop might be a good example. Obviously, the candy end is going to be a lot denser than the wooden or the cardboard stick. But I think the more common example you'll run into is something like a table. I mean, most shapes that you run into in Box2D in these types of games will have the same type of material throughout. And if we were to model this table, let's see we were looking at it from a side view in our Box2D engine, we would have one shape probably for this tabletop, and then one shape for the right leg, and one shape for the left leg. It would all be the same material, but remember that shapes in Box2D have to be convex objects, and you wouldn't be able to create this U-shape using just one shape. So the body, which would be the table, would consist of 3 shapes. And those 3 shapes would just happen to have the exact same density, friction, restitution, and so on. That's probably what you're going to more often run into in these types of simulations. But remember that they don't necessarily have to be all the same homogeneous material. And speaking of homogeneous materials, probably the most common example you'll see out there are these sort of Tetris-like shapes. If I were to represent this Tetris piece in Box2D, like you may have seen in some other games out there, I would do it probably by creating 4 shapes. One shape essentially for each of these squares, but then I would combine all of these shapes into one body. Again, all 4 shapes essentially move as one. I wouldn't be able to move these shapes individually. So I can look at it as one entire body just made up of 4 shapes that all happen to be squares. Note, however, that something like a wagon would not be an example of multiple shapes, one body. In this case, you actually have pieces that you'd want to move independently from each other. You'd probably want the wheels to turn, but you'd obviously want the wheels to turn without the entire wagon turning. This handle you'd probably want to rotate up and down. So in this case, if I were to represent this wagon, I would probably represent it with several bodies. One body to make up the boxy part of the wagon, another body to make up the rear tire, another body to make up the front tire, and probably another body to make up this handle that would raise up and down. If you were to look at a stick figure or a rag doll, this would also be multiple bodies. Each of these joints that manages to move independently from the rest of the rag doll would be its own body. And granted, you're going to have connections between all these bodies so that when you drag its head or you drag its leg, the rest of the body moves with it. But they are capable of essentially moving independently from each other. They're not all frozen as one piece, and so they would be multiple bodies. I hope that made things clearer and not more confusing.